Hey everybody, welcome to the crew. I'm Sea Lord Jenda, or Joseph if you prefer, and this is the history of the world. We are continuing to make our way chronologically through history, covering all the happenings around the world with new episodes releasing every week, hopefully, although at the moment it's kind of every other because this episode is way too long and I should have broken it into two parts. Sorry about that. So the year is now 1400 BCE, and another century lies ahead of us. In the last century, sorry, in the last century, we saw the Kassites of Babylon reunify most of southern and central Mesopotamia. We saw them eliminate the Shang Dynasty down here near the coast. We saw Assyria definitively subjugated by the Mitanni, who remain the preeminent power of the region. The Hittites to the west are dominated by dynastic infighting, dealing with nomadic invaders, the Kaskians from the north. The new kingdom of Egypt it's actually the 18th dynasty still, saw a succession of strong rulers and extended its rule through the Levant, well into Syria, far to the north. After several clashes between Egypt and the Mitanni, they've more or less achieved peace at present. It may not last forever, but at the moment, the border in Syria is pretty much peaceful, stable. Mainland Europe remains semi-settled at most at this point. The Mycenaean civilization in Greece, however, has reached a pretty mature state. They've absorbed Crete and especially the old city of Knossos, and is spreading steadily throughout the Aegean and even across to the far side of the Aegean, mainland Anatolia. Further east, India is still pretty much entirely disunified following the now half-millennia old collapse of the Indus River Valley civilization, but there have been some waves of migration in the last century or two, Indo-Aryans moving in from the steppes, and is now beginning to establish the basis of what will be a very long-lasting, well, with many changes and developments, common culture. China is still under the rule of the Shang Dynasty around the Yellow River, although there are significant, slightly less developed civilizations and alleged barbarians still controlling large areas of present-day China, frankly the majority. In the Americas, there is permanent civilization now starting to develop in Mesoamerica, namely the Olmecs, after a few false starts that didn't last. Now, as of 1400, the most powerful state in the world is undoubtedly, the new kingdom of Egypt. There are, in the last few centuries, this is finally a world in which multiple peer states consistently coexist. The new kingdom, the Mitanni, Babylon, the Hittites, etc. But the new kingdom of Egypt is far and away the most powerful of the lot. An economic and military powerhouse, fueled by the consistent yearly flooding of the mighty Nile River, and going through a sustained period of excellent leadership. Hatshepsut, Thutmose the First, Second, and Third, Syria, the Levant, and Nubia are mostly under Egyptian rule, and with peace made with the Mitanni, there's really no immediate threat to the new kingdom at this point. Just a year ago, Amenhotep II died after a reign of over 25 years in which he maintained the empire and made peace with the Mitanni along with all the usual building of a pharaoh. The new pharaoh here, Thutmose IV, was not the intended heir until the premature death of the intended heir, and he takes some pains to secure his status. He restores the Sphinx and leaves a stele describing a dream vision he supposedly had while sleeping beneath the Sphinx, in which he was told he would be pharaoh in exchange for restoring it. That said, his reign overall is peaceful, more than any of his immediate predecessors. He fights maybe one minor campaign in Nubia, putting down rebellion, maybe another minor one in Syria, but this may actually refer to other things that happen in Syria. He mostly focuses on internal construction. He keeps expanding the Temple of Karnak, which is pretty much the religious center for all of Egypt at this point. He completes what in future will be the Lateran obelisk, which ends up in Rome, and likely other construction work. Actually, the most significant achievement of his reign is his marriage to a daughter of the Mitanni king, Artatama, This daughter probably Mutemwia, but that doesn't seem confirmed. In any case, this marriage seals the peace between the two most powerful states, probably in the world, at least in the West. He weds his half-sister Yaret, and at least one apparent commoner, Nefertari, and produces at least 7 children by his various wives. Sons Amenhotep, Seatum, and Amenemhat, and daughters Tia, Amenemopet, Petepihu, and Tentamun. Despite this substantial progeny, he dies quite young, likely only in his late 20s, and modern medical examiners have speculated he may suffer a form of epilepsy, probably genetic, which would explain the deaths of several other members of the royal family. He therefore reigns only about 10 years and dies in about 1391, leaving the throne to his young son, Amenhotep III. Amenhotep III, son of Thutmose IV and Mutemwia, is probably only about 10 years old when he takes the throne of the new kingdom. There's probably at least a short regency as a result, though we're not sure who the regent is. In any case, he asserts full control probably pretty young, and his reign ends up being a very long and very prosperous one. He fights only one significant military campaign, crushing a rebellion in Kush during his teenage years. That's the same as Nubia. He may also extend the new kingdom's presence on Cyprus, which is paying tribute to the new kingdom at this time, although it's not under exactly firm control the way the regions on land are, but they do seem to ship copper regularly to Egypt as tribute. After that, his reign will be pretty much peaceful, and we'll see the very peak of the new kingdom's artistic flowering. Amenhotep III constructs over 250 statues of himself, and those are just the ones that survive the next 3,000 years for us to know about. He considerably expands the great temple of Karnak, builds himself a lavish mortuary temple, including 2 60-foot or 18-meter statues of himself, although sadly that temple is too close to the Nile and will be ruined by flooding within a few centuries. Over 600 statues of the goddess Sekhmet, rose granite lions to guard the Temple of Soleb in Nubia, and a massive palace complex for himself at Malkata, just as a sampling of many, many construction projects. These are just some of the more famous ones that have survived. He lives to celebrate 3 seed festivals, the first of which is held only after 30 years on the throne and then every 3 years thereafter, and he does so in exceptionally spectacular fashion. He builds a host of new temples and statues for the occasion, thanks to the overflowing coffers of the new kingdom. In foreign affairs, he doesn't make war on any of his neighbors, but some diplomatic correspondence has survived to make its way to us, which demonstrates that he does communicate regularly with the rulers of the Mitanni, the Hittites, Babylon, even Assyria, various smaller cities and states. And frankly, most of that correspondence, at least what survived, consists of them paying tribute or requesting gifts from the magnificent pharaoh. That might be what the Egyptians want us to see, and it might also be that it's a sort of considered to be the polite way of doing trade is by exchanging gifts in some sense. But he does notably reject a request for his daughter's hand from the king of Babylon, but himself marries another Mitanni princess, which pretty much confirms what's obvious enough from the Egyptian writings in any case. They have a really strong sense of superiority over all of their neighbors. But that superiority is also kind of acknowledged by their neighbors at this time. Egypt is the dominant superpower of the late Bronze Age. Under Amenhotep III, the new kingdom is mighty, prosperous, and quite simply all but unrivaled. The Mitanni are the closest thing to a rival, but the Mitanni have a lot of problems of their own. He marries first Ti, who is a daughter of the powerful courtiers Yuya and Thuya, and will maintain her as his first wife throughout his reign. He also marries Jiddakipa, daughter of King Shutarna II of Mitanni, and 25 years later will then also marry her niece Tadukipa, daughter of the following King Tushratta of Mitanni. And in an extra incestual move, even by ancient Egyptian standards, his own daughters, Sitamun and Isit, become his wives near the end of his reign. No indication to me that it's just a formal or ceremonial thing either, unfortunately. Ti remains very important in the court throughout his life, and sometimes even places her name on official acts. treats directly with foreign rulers in Amenhotep's name. Amenhotep has at least 2 sons by Thi, Thutmose and Amenhotep, and along with those first 2 daughters, Sitamun and Iset, and also 2 more daughters, Henutaneb and Nebeta, and potentially numerous other children. Amenhotep III's reign lasts nearly 40 years before he dies in about 1353 BCE, at the age of only about 50 still, having suffered arthritis and obesity near the end of his life. Late in his reign, his oldest son and intended heir Thutmose dies of unknown causes, likely natural, as there are a variety of genetic illnesses running in the rather heavily inbred family by this time. In fact, the eldest son Thutmose is only really known thanks to the sarcophagus of his cat, which we've discovered, and describes its association with the crown prince. Amenhotep III is instead succeeded by his younger son, Amenhotep IV. Amenhotep's age is not certain, but he's likely a teenager. You'll probably notice right away his statue here has quite a different artistic style than what is standard in Egypt. His reign begins pretty normally. All the usual practices and offerings are continued, but right from the start he has a slightly notable liking for the god Aten as compared to the other gods. Not necessarily an extraordinary one initially, but things quickly start to take a sharp turn for the worst, as he increasingly seems to prefer Aten as primary among the gods, and then in the 5th year of Amenhotep IV's reign, he changes his name from Amenhotep, which is associated with the god Amun, currently more or less the acknowledged leader of the Egyptian pantheon, to Akhenaten, to emphasize his relationship with the god Aten. Aten is formerly an aspect of Ra, but has risen to prominence as the primary creator god recently, sort of competing with Amun, but this is kind of a natural part of the cycle of pantheistic religion. The gods rarely remain entirely stable over the course of centuries and millennia going by. They take on new roles, new gods pop up, older gods fall out of favor, etc. That's not in itself surprising, the rise of Aten to some prominence. What is surprising is that Akhenaten takes things much further. He founds himself a new capital city, Akhetaten, halfway between Memphis and Thebes in order to build an uncorrupted site for the worship of Aten, probably after some serious clashes with the priests of Amun in Thebes. It should be noted the cult of Amun is centered at the Temple of Karnak, has prospered immensely from the generations of lavish support from the 18th Dynasty pharaohs, and is quite powerful in its own right by this point. Akhetaten is a planned city centered around the great temple of Aten, built quickly with small standardized blocks and by all but halting construction everywhere else, particularly around Thebes, and paid for by diverting the funding from the cults of all other gods. It is not a success. Oh, they build the city, but only Akhenaten himself, his court, servants, etc., and his most loyal subjects and converts to the cult of Aten actually move to Akhetaten, so it certainly never exceeds Memphis or Thebes in size. How exactly his subjects react to all this is not obvious from the documents necessarily, but it seems pretty likely that this move is widely unpopular. It's not just that he likes Aten too much, it's that he's, at this point, really overturning millennia of religious practice by excluding all of the other gods to focus on a primary god, almost completely. In foreign affairs, Akhenaten doesn't change much. He's not interventionist. Notably, Byblos is conquered by the small border state of Amurru without Egyptian intervention, although this may have been considered to be an affair between 2 Egyptian vassals at the time. But eventually, Amurru defects from Egyptian tributary status and joins with the Hittites instead, which is a minor but a definite loss on the northern frontier of Egypt's empire. He's not entirely inactive, though. There are definitely Egyptian troops regularly touring in Syria on the Levant, during his reign, and possibly even occasionally clashing with the Hittites, who are resurging in the north by this time, but we'll get to that a bit later. He also conducts at least one expedition in Nubia, crushing rebellious and nomadic tribes there like most rulers. Now, Akhenaten's domestic life is pretty typical for a pharaoh. He takes several wives. The foremost is Nefertiti here, whose origins are unknown, but she's been very well preserved thanks to this very lifelike Aten-style bust preserved from recovered from the buried studio of its sculptor, actually, thousands of years later. He also marries Kia, who is possibly a Mitanni princess. Likely he has at least one sister wife, but we don't know her name. He marries the Mitanni princess Tadukipa, who wed his father. This might be the same as Kia, unclear. Kia might be a pet name, essentially. And one or more daughters of the king of Babylon, among others, extending the diplomatic marriage policy that's come to be now. And by these various wives, he has a host of children. The family tree is quite confused in this period due to later vandalism, but he probably has two sons, at least, Smenkhara and Tutankhaten, along with a large number of daughters, including 6 by Nefertiti. Known daughters include Meritaten, Meketaten, Ankhesenaten, Neferneferuaten Tashirit, Neferneferure, Setapenre, and probably Ankhesenpaten Tasheret and Meritaten Tasheret. Yeah, you don't need to know all those, don't worry about him. Despite his radical religious reforms, the New Kingdom is apparently still stable until at least the last years of his reign. In his 9th year, Akhenaten takes another big step for the worse. He's already stripped most of the funding from the priests of other gods and has personally pretty much started to ignore the other gods, but he then takes the definitive step of declaring Aten the only permissible god to worship in Egypt, and also that all such prayers should be directed not directly to Aten, but to him as pharaoh, as he as the pharaoh is the only one worthy to address the god. He particularly targets followers of Amun. Many temples of Amun are defaced, and the open worship of Amun is somewhat, not exactly forced underground. Followers of most gods are not quite as actively persecuted as those of Amun. None of the cults of other gods actually die out, and for the most part they're not really even forced underground, except perhaps in Akhetaten itself. The pharaoh's command is probably pretty much unenforceable throughout most of Egypt. Realistically, other than his personal court, most people are not hardcore Atenists, and the various priests, who are some of the most powerful people in Egypt, would obviously quite unanimously oppose these changes, except presumably the priests of Aten. So the final years of his reign end up being particularly chaotic. Frankly, almost all we know of Akhenaten comes from excavation of Akhetaten, the city, which is long abandoned now. It seems likely that late in his reign a plague strikes Egypt, which kills the queen mother Ti, the royal wife Tia, and the daughters Meketaten, Neferneferure, and Setapenre. And given these fatalities, Akhenaten might name both his son Smenkhare and his wife Nefertiti as co-regents during his final years to ensure continuity of government. He's never overthrown, though. And ultimately, Akhenaten dies after 17 years on the throne in about 1336, leaving the future of his dynasty and his religious reforms quite uncertain. His immediate successor is probably his son Smenkhare, who's wed to his daughter Meritaten, so Smenkhare's sister. Due to his short reign and the destruction wreaked by later pharaohs, we cannot say very much about Smenkhare. It's not even certain that he actually rules on his own. He may have just been a co-regent prior to his father's death. If he does rule on his own, he dies within a year or less on the throne, probably of the same disease that's been wreaking havoc on the kingdom. The following years are even more chaotic. Egypt seems to at least briefly fall under the rule of a female pharaoh who takes the name Neferneferuaten. This is either Nefertiti as queen mother or recent queen, or Meritaten as wife of the newly deceased Smenkhare, but we can't say either of these with any certainty, nor can we entirely rule out other candidates. There is actually an extreme degree of dispute about this among Egyptologists. I'm not going to get into it any deeper. I feel safe to summarize it as it's probably either Nefertiti or Meritaten. It might not be either. They might not have ruled practically independently for long at all, if at all. But it doesn't matter much in the grander scheme of things, because frankly, whoever rules, they rule for 2 or 3 years at the most, before somehow or other Akhenaten's other younger son, Tutankhaten, ends up on the throne. Now, Tutankhaten is... whoever was ruling before him might have been just ruling as a regent in his name, in any case, and Tutankhaten is still only 9 when he does appear on the throne. He is married a few years later to his half-sister, Ankhesenaten, who is actually guiding the court during this boy king's regency is not entirely clear. Probably the viziers of Upper and Lower Egypt, especially a guy named Ai, who will come into the story later, but whether through some sincere belief on the boy king's part or just the guidance of the officials who were probably in practical control of the kingdom, the first years of Tutankhaten's reign see a drastic series of reversals. Tutankhaten abandons the new city Akhetaten, which crumbles back into the sands, unlived in. He returns the royal court to Memphis, which is now... Thebes was the capital for a long time, but Memphis becomes the de facto capital sometime before this, and the definite capital at this point, because it's more centrally located, closer to the Syrian conquests of Egypt. In the 3rd year of his reign, Tutankhaten restores the cult of Amun to supremacy over the cult of Aten, and changes the names of himself and his wife, from Tutankhaten and Ankhesenaten to Tutankhamun, aka King Tut, and Ankhesenamun, symbolizing the change in gods. Thebes, although not the capital again, becomes the religious center of the realm again, centered around the Temple of Karnak. Tutankhamun, or at least his advisors, restore most of the various temples desecrated by Akhenaten, put down rebellions in Syria and Kush. How much he's directly involved in all this is highly unclear, but the new kingdom's in a bit of a state of turmoil throughout his reign, but slowly begins to quiet down. He reverses his father's more extreme reforms and gets things more or less under control. Unfortunately, the boy king is not really a healthy one. He's never able to grow up and throw off his advisors entirely. Although heavily inbred, he's probably not as bad as a lot of later scholars have sometimes claimed. We've tested and actually rejected. He did not have most of the obvious genetic diseases that we can test for. There was long a belief that he had a club foot, but that's actually not very certain either. He has scoliosis, but it's really mild and probably would not have been crippling. What can be proven is that he suffers repeatedly from infection with some of the most severe strains of malaria, and as a result is probably never a strong child. And then, near his death, well, he suffers a compound leg fracture. And frankly, without antibiotics in the world, a compound leg fracture is a potential, even a probable death sentence for nearly anyone. He dies very shortly after suffering the fracture. It never even tries to heal, really. All elaborate theories aside, he probably dies from a simple fall down some stairs or something, or perhaps a chariot accident. Of course, these are the kind of things one could make look like an accident if one were inclined to murder the king, but that's extremely unprovable. And in any case, Tutankhamun dies at the age of about 18 in 1323, having technically reigned almost 10 years, but only taken true power in the last few years. This precipitates a succession crisis. One of the first in history of which we actually have some substantial details, although probably not fully accurate details, but better than nothing. Tutankhamun has no sons. He did father twin daughters with Ankhesenamun, but they were unfortunately stillborn. He names an heir, at least allegedly, a general named Horemheb who leads the Egyptian armies, but Ankhesenamun, who is essentially the leading surviving member of the royal family after her husband's death, declines to marry a servant with no royal blood, and instead she apparently writes a letter to the king of the Hittites, who is now Suppiluliuma I, and asks for a son whom she might wed. And that son would rule Egypt, in essence. This raises the specter of the same dynasty, a dynastic union of the two preeminent kingdoms of the world at this point. But Suppiluliuma is unsurprisingly skeptical. He takes some persuading. He suspects a trap because Egypt and the Hittites are not on great terms. And in the time it finally takes him to convince him to dispatch a son, Zananza, the throne falls to another. Not to Horemheb either, but to A. That's A-Y. A vizier and long-standing advisor to Tutankhamun and his line. A apparently first rose to prominence under Akhenaten, possibly a brother of Akhenaten's mother T, or a tutor of Tutankhamun, or both. A is probably the primary power behind the throne, or effective regent for Tutankhamun for most of his reign, and he's the most likely culprit if anyone did murder the young Tutankhamun, but that's wildly unproven. What is proven is that A moves faster than Horemheb or Ankhesenamun. He personally arranges and oversees the funeral rites for Tutankhamun, and then marries Ankhesenamun himself to secure his legitimacy, and proclaims himself pharaoh. He quickly, more or less, attempts to sideline Horemheb, naming another man, Nakhmin, as commander of Egypt's armies, probably A's own son. Horemheb is not willing to immediately dispute the issue by force, and A becomes ruler of Egypt. The Hittite prince, Zananza, dies on the way to Egypt, probably killed by Egyptian soldiers under the orders of A. This, unsurprisingly, well, they deny having done it, of course, but this unsurprisingly infuriates the Hittites. They launch an attack on Syria, but then inadvertently, through prisoners, bring back a plague, probably the same plague that swept through Egypt just a decade or so ago, but maybe a different one. In any case, they bring back a plague which causes a lot of deaths amongst the Hittites and temporarily halts the war. A therefore finds himself securely on the throne, but he's an old man already, and he dies after only 4 years of rule in 1319 BCE. Upon his death, his efforts to sideline Horemheb prove inadequate. Honestly, probably Horemheb only stood aside because A was already old and in ill health. Nakhmin is brushed aside. He actually probably dies unexpectedly around the same time as A. Why, we can only take the most wild speculation at. Might have been natural causes. Might have been Horemheb. Who knows? In any case, Horemheb is able to secure power as the new pharaoh. He takes the unfortunate Ankhesenamun as his wife in turn. This would be her third husband in about 5 years. And she likely dies soon after in any case. She certainly never has any children. Horemheb, therefore, marks a complete break from the line of Akhenaten. He is still considered a member of the 18th dynasty because we don't demarcate the Egyptian dynasties on blood for whatever reason. But Horemheb he oversees the total restoration of the cults of the various gods. He expands the temple of Karnak once again, which of course is the stronghold of the priests of Amun at this point. He, however, also prevents the priests from becoming too contentious by appointing many of his subordinates from the military, men loyal to him from decades of service, to important religious positions. He appoints new viziers in Thebes and Memphis to oversee Upper and Lower Egypt in his name, appoints many new officials, and in general he restores and reorders the bureaucracy, the priesthood, and the military after the chaos of the Aten cult. To cement his new leaf, He conducts an extensive damnatio memoriae. He wipes out all traces of his immediate predecessors wherever he can, and his own successors will continue that campaign. Hence our modern dearth of knowledge about Akhenaten and his immediate successors. Frankly, in most places, even the very names of Akhenaten and Tutankhamun and and Smenkhare and Neferneferuat and all of them, their names are erased in most places. The Temple of Savaten are destroyed. Akhenaten itself is torn down and the materials are reused for construction elsewhere. Most of the knowledge we have about Akhenaten comes from us finally rediscovering the ruins of Akhetaten in relatively modern times, and enough still were buried under the sands to give us some idea of what happened, but Horemheb's campaign is pretty effective, and his successors will follow up on it, so it's very effective overall. Which is also your clear marker that people were not very amused by this attempt at pseudo-monotheism that Akhenaten embarked upon. Now, Horemheb is originally married to Amenia, but she dies before he even takes the throne, and when Ankhesenamun dies, childless and young, he takes one Mudnejdmet as his new wife. She is potentially a sister of Nefertiti, which would offer some semblance of relationship with the previous royal family, but that's not certain. In any case, Mudnejdmet does not give Horemheb an heir either. In fact, she maybe has a daughter that doesn't go mentioned anywhere, or possibly she has a stillborn child or several, and based on her mummy, which we found, well, we know several things from finding her mummy. One, that she'd given birth probably to several children, but as none of them ever appear, they were either perhaps before she married Horemheb, because she was probably of a mature age already when she did, or they were stillborn children. And most likely she dies in childbirth about 13 years into Horemheb's reign, and is buried with the body of the newborn infant. Unlike most kings, Horemheb is apparently not so worried about this. He doesn't take half a dozen new wives after Mudnejdmet doesn't give him an heir in the first couple of years, or after she dies even, and eventually Horemheb dies without any heirs of his body. His reign is either 14 years or possibly 27. 14 is more supported by the archaeology, but based on the general dating estimations for the reigns, it would almost have to be 27, or there's also a strange gap in the dating, so for now I'll work with the latter number so as not to screw the dating system up. Assuming that longer reign, it is still Horemheb that sits the throne of the New Kingdom in 1300. That is a new kingdom shaken by the Aten crisis, but rebuilding and finding its strength once again. The New Kingdom is still fundamentally the greatest power of its time. It's had a bit of a shock here, but it's only slightly reduced in territory, really, and there was no open war. There was plague, but that struck its neighbors now as well, so that washes out more or less. There is, however, a new rival to the north of Egypt, which we will discuss now. Just to remind you, in 1400, the situation is as follows. The Mitanni, the preeminent power, the Hittites to the west have been consumed by dynastic infighting for something like 2 centuries now. Kassite Babylon is slowly regaining strength, but still hardly up to its glory days, although they have reabsorbed sea land. Assyria is a subjugated vassal of the Mitanni. This situation has pretty much not changed in the last century, almost 2 really, except for Babylon's reintegration of sea land, but it changes pretty drastically in this century. Also, a correction from last episode. I said Muwatalli was likely still Hittite king in 1400, but I was wrong. It's probably actually Tudhaliya II by now. The line of succession not too complicated. Muwatalli is murdered by one of his chief officers, as he himself had done to take the throne. That officer puts his son Tudhaliya I on the throne. Tudhaliya slightly reasserts Hittite power in the south, and is then followed by his son Tudhaliya II, Tudhaliya II is actually the man sitting on the throne about 1400, based on the most logical dating system. So in 1400, the kings are probably Tudhaliya II for the Hittites, Artatama I for the Mitanni, Kadashman-Harb for Babylon, and Ashur-nadin-Ah II for Assyria. This will not be on the test, don't worry, and the Hittite and Mitanni kings are the more important at this point. Quite early in the century, Artatama I of Mitanni is followed by Shutarna II. The Mitanni kingdom is prosperous, powerful, loosely allied to Egypt by marriage. Tudhaliya II is forced to face the confederations of Arzawa and Asua in the west, and repel attacks from the Casca in the north as well. He attempts to set up the annexation of the he succeeds, actually, at least briefly, in annexing the border state of Kizzuwatna, but later in his reign has to fight Arzawa again, doesn't really make any permanent gains. When Tudhaliya II dies in about 1390, he has slightly revived the Hittites with the gain of Kizzuwatna, at least temporarily, and holding back the Arzawa. But, well, things get a little messy after his death. His heir is Arnuwanda. Arnuwanda is actually heir by marriage to Tudhaliya's daughter Asmu-Nikal. Arnuwanda does not succeed in continuing the revival. A treacherous vassal, Maduwata, in the west helps the Arzawa ambush and destroy a Hittite army, and the Hittites are pushed back with the Arzawa expanding at their expense, and frankly, by the end of Arnuwanda's reign, the Hittites are penned in central Anatolia, enemies on all sides, Arzawa to the west, the Mitanni to the east, the Casca to the north, with the sea to the south. Arnuwanda is followed by his son with Asmu-Nikal, Tudhaliya II. This that you're seeing here, this strange thing, is apparently the seal of Tudhaliya III, that is. To the east, Shutarna II of the Mitanni dies about the same time. He is briefly succeeded by Artashutarna. Artashutarna is then murdered and followed by his younger brother Tushratta. Tushratta's sister is already married to Amenhotep III of Egypt. His daughter will later also marry Amenhotep, which further secures the strong Mitanni relationship with Egypt, but this doesn't really result in much direct military aid between the two. And Tushratta is quite young at this time, so it's actually the Hittites that manage to begin to exercise their power, eventually. Tudhaliya III does not have a great reign. As I said, he faces, by the start of his reign, the worst crisis in the history of the Hittites. Ringed in by enemies, Mitanni to the east, Casca to the north, Arzawa to the west. He is simply unable to hold them all off. Hattusa itself, the Hittite capital, is sacked by the Casca sometime during his reign. He moves to a temporary capital at Samuha. That's sacked by the Hayasi Azi, a new power coming from the Caucasus, a group of tribes. Tudhaliya III then moves his capital to Sapanua and still hangs on to power. He then has the fortune to, he promotes a general, Suppiluliuma, into command of his armies, and that turns out to be a good move, because together with that general, he is able to defeat the Hayasa Azi and force them into vassalage. They also defeat the Casca, hold off the Arzawa, and more or less stabilize the country. But truth be told, when Tudhaliya III dies in about 1350, the Hittite kingdom is at best partially recovered and still surrounded by enemies. Tudhaliya III is supposed to be followed by his son Tudhaliya the Younger, who would be Tudhaliya IV, but instead he is followed by his general, Suppiluliuma I. And unless the internet is pulling an elaborate prank on me, this is the only surviving substantial statue of Suppiluliuma I. It is stylized differently than its Egyptian equivalents, I would say. Or, frankly, any ancient equivalents I've seen elsewhere. The eyes are just, they're quite something, aren't they? Anyway, Suppiluliuma has already led many of the successful campaigns that saved the Hittites from total collapse, and he is a ruthless man. So far as we know, he was never disloyal to Tudalia III in life, but on the king's death, well, he's not so loyal because he promptly arranges the murder of the would-be Tudalia IV and seizes power for himself, in true Hittite tradition to be fair. He then marries Tudalia III's daughter Henti. Her opinion on this is not recorded. And, well, ruthless he may be, but politics and war tend to lend themselves well to ruthlessness. And Suppiluliuma's reign will be long and extremely successful. In fact, he not only saves the Hittite kingdom, but he brings it back to its glory days and then some. In the west, he fights Arzawa to a standstill and secures the frontier. In the north, he arranges the marriage of the king of the House Azi to his sister and secures their vassal status. He campaigns several times against the Casca and establishes Hittite outposts in an attempt to hold them down. This is never totally successful. They rebel numerous times, but it turns the war from a war of the Hittites trying to prevent the Casca from burning their capital down over and over again to the Casca attempting to evict the Hittites from their homeland, which is a much better scenario for the Hittites. With the frontiers to the north and west semi-secure, Suppiluliuma eventually turns the bulk of his attention to the east and the dominant Mitanni kingdom. His first campaign against them is apparently a failure. Tushratta sends a letter to Amenhotep III mentioning his victory and sending a sample of the booty as a gift. Then, however, Suppiluliuma learns from his mistakes. He makes an alliance with Artatama II, a rival claimant of some sort to the Mitanni throne, possibly a brother of Tushratta or perhaps simply from a cadet branch. He also marries a Babylonian princess to secure that flank. And eventually, Artatama launches a rebellion with Suppiluliuma's backing. Suppiluliuma then launches what will be an exceptionally successful single-year campaign. He raids deep into Mitanni territory, including around their capital, although his claim to have sacked it is probably exaggerated at this point. He takes advantage of their divided forces and the weakness of Tushratta, shreds up a lot of Mitanni land, and then turns south into Syria, overrunning the various cut-off Mitanni vassals there, Aleppo, Kadesh, and just half a dozen and a dozen others, converting them all from Mitanni to Hittite vassals, which is a major swing in the balance of power. There's then apparently peace for at least a few years, but war soon breaks out again. Suppiluliuma actually briefly faces attacks from both the Mitanni across the Euphrates and the Egyptians from the south attempting to take Kadesh, but things turn in favor of the Hittites. Helped out by, probably this correlates to the difficult period after the death of Akhenaten in Egypt, which pretty much prevents the Egyptians from continuing any offensive action, and Suppiluliuma is able to raid deep into Mitanni territory once again. What their army, no exactly victory in the field over their armies recorded, but clearly they weren't able to stop him, and this time Tushratta's inability to stop Suppiluliuma costs him. Tushratta is murdered by his own sons, and civil war follows in the Mitanni kingdom. Artatama II, the rebel, briefly rules. Then his son, Shutarna III, takes power. But by then, Tushratta's own son, Satiwaza, forced to flee from the rebels, had gone to Babylon, and then traveled to the Hittite kingdom and asks Suppiluliuma for aid. Satiwaza is given the hand of one of Suppiluliuma's daughters in marriage, and the aid of the Hittite army. They seize the Mitanni capital, Washukani, still struggling with civil war and rebellion, and Satiwaza is enthroned as king of the Mitanni. However, that doesn't mean so much anymore. The kingdom is shattered. A Hittite army has put him on the throne. Satiwaza is little better than a Hittite vassal, and apparently formally acknowledges the loss of all the lands west of the Euphrates to the Hittites. Almost as bad territorially, the long-reigning King Ariba Adad of Assyria takes advantage of the confusion to reassert Assyrian independence, and that newly independent kingdom is almost immediately stronger than what's left of the Mitanni remnant. It's also about this time that Suppiluliuma's son Zananza is asked to marry Ankhesenamun of Egypt and eventually sent, despite a lot of skepticism on Suppiluliuma's part. And that skepticism proves justified because, as we went over before, Ankhesenamun is forced to marry Ai before Zananza arrives, and Zananza is murdered en route, probably at Ai's direction. Suppiluliuma's vengeful attacks on Egyptian Syria end up being his undoing because his army take prisoners who carry a plague and inadvertently bring it back to Egypt, back to the Hittite kingdom, that is. Probably the same plague that recently ravaged Egypt, and it proceeds to ravage the Hittites as well. This is probably rabbit pox, by the way, but we're not entirely sure. In the end, it is this illness that kills Suppiluliuma after a reign of almost 30 years. His son Arnuanda II briefly follows, but then dies of the same illness. And eventually, his younger brother Mursili II takes the throne. Mursili II, well, by the time he comes to the throne, the situation is this. The Hittite kingdom is more of a Hittite empire by 1320, which is the date at this point. It rules most of central and eastern Anatolia up to the Euphrates, large parts of northern Syria up to what's now the border with Egypt. They are, however, a bit distracted. What you see here on this tablet is Mursili II's prayers to stop plague sweeping through the empire. Doesn't really work, but of course the plague dies out on its own eventually, naturally. The Mitanni kingdom, dominant for 2 centuries, shattered. Shatiwaza rules a rump kingdom trapped between the Hittites and Assyria. Assyria, entirely independent under King Ashur-uballit I, and Ashur-uballit I not only proclaims himself king of Assyria, but also asserts the title of Great King or King of the Universe, and claims Assyria's seat at the table of great powers, such as they are. Meanwhile, to the south, the Babylonians have pretty much been vibing, having a good century, not getting involved in all the wars to their north for the most part, but having some good success of their own. King Kurigalzu I in the mid-century, this is his seal, is able to sack Susa and bring much of Elam to heel as a vassal, which is a success not achieved in many centuries by the Mesopotamians. And he conducts a lot more new construction than most of his predecessors as well, including the fortress of Dur-Karagalzu in the north to protect lapis lazuli trade routes. Babylon gets involved in the politics of the north a little more once again when Bernaburiash II of Babylon here marries the Assyrian princess Mubalatat Sharua. This is not a problem in itself. The problem comes when Bernaburiash dies in about 1333. His half-Assyrian son and heir, Karahardash, is then killed in an anti-Assyrian revolt by the army, which appoints a pure Kassite named Susagas as king. Susagas doesn't last either. Ashurubballit of Assyria intervenes on behalf of his now dead grandson, and unseats Susagas, appointing a certain Kurigalzu II as king. Kurigalzu II is possibly a son of Karahardash, or otherwise just somehow a favored candidate of the Syrians. Now, unsurprisingly, this initially brings a period of peace, but it doesn't last. Ashurubballit dies in about 1328, and Kurigalzu II's feelings of loyalty to Assyria quickly start to wane in favor of his own kingdom that he now rules, and he ends up warring with the new king of Assyria, Enlil-Nirari. The two kingdoms are apparently pretty well matched at this point. The Assyrian account claims a total victory. The Babylonian account claims a total victory. In practice, it seems the two sides fought an indecisive battle at Sugagu on the Tigris, which results in little territorial change but reinforces the hostility between them, and their successors, Erik Denili in Assyria and Nazi Marutash in Babylon, will continue the hostilities without decisive result by the turn of the century. So by 1300, Assyria and Babylon are both significant regional powers. They have some old historic enmity, and that's now flared up to some serious heights of hostility, but neither has the better of the other for now. Meanwhile, to the west, The Hittite Empire, well, Mursili II might be young and inexperienced, but he does succeed in holding his father's empire together. He campaigns repeatedly against the Kaska in the north, the Arzawa in the west, and Hayasa Azi in the northeast. After the Battle of Gunavara in about 1312, he all but shatters Hayasa's military power, and that year is marked by a solar eclipse at the start of his campaign, interestingly. The Hayasa never really show up as a military power again after that. By 1300, Mursili II rules a relatively stable empire and one of the world's most powerful states. The Mitanni are broken for good and essentially a Hatti vassal. Assyria and Babylon are still mostly just regional powers. Kaskia and Arzawa are still somewhat hostile, but are also pretty browbeaten at this point, and are calling them outright vassal domains is probably generous, but they are certainly not really not capable of fighting the Hittite Empire anymore head to head. In truth, there's only one real rival left for the Hittites by 1300, and that is the new kingdom of Egypt. They have had a period of weakness, during which the Hittites were able to acquire Amurru here, including Kadesh and Byblos, and that was formerly an Egyptian vassal and very much a loss for Egypt, their first in quite a while, but not exactly a crippling one, and the new kingdom is now back together and building itself back up, while the Hittites are also rebuilding from the plague, recovering strength, and both sides are going to be looking very shortly to assert themselves in Syria. The Egyptians want Amurru back. The Hittites don't want to let them. They want to assert themselves as the strongest power in the world. A collision is probably inevitable. Now, there are, of course, many other events taking place around the rest of the world. In the Aegean, the Mycenaean Greeks spend most of the century colonizing their way across the sea. They've already colonized a lot of the islands in the Aegean. They colonize most of the rest. They expand their trade relations down into Cyprus, over to Syria, even over to Italy and Spain. Aside from the Aegean islands, they reach the mainland and settle in Anatolia with their capital at Miletus, and also several smaller nearby cities. They may even support enemies of the Hittites, the Arzawa mainly, in their wars with the Hittites, and it's probable that the story, the semi-mythical city of Troy, originates about this time as a Greek settlement, or a Mycenaean settlement, that is, within the next century or two in any case. Further east, this is somewhat legendary at best, but legend would have it that the Battle of the Ten Kings takes place in India during this century, which pits the tribe known as the Bharatas and the king Sudas against a coalition of other tribes, and the Bharatas win a crushing victory and ultimately unite a large area into the so-called Kuru kingdom, which controls most of Punjab. This map depicts most of the migrations taking place around this time, with Indo-Aryans arriving and slowly expanding throughout India. The details of all this are just highly sketchy and suspect, even by the standards of the time, but it does seem that the outcome, at least, is more or less historical. There is a kingdom arising in Punjab, or on the upper Indus, the Kuru kingdom, we'll call it, which is able to unite most of Punjab under its rule, and this is more or less the first state-level organization in India since the collapse of the Indus River Valley civilization. It never really expands across the rest of India, but it does become the culturally dominant power within India, and will be the synthesis and origination point for the union of Indo-Aryan with native existing subcontinental religion and culture, creating what at this point is Brahmanism and will much later be the precursor to the modern Hinduism and other religious cultural array of India. Sorry, this whole area is kind of. There's a lot of myth and legend tied in with this whole area, and not a lot of really simple English sources about it, let's say. We make our way east to China. China is still semi-unified under the Shang Dynasty, which rules only really a small percentage of modern-day China, but they do rule the core heartland area along the Yellow River and part of the Yangtze River, and probably are slowly expanding. This map is not really dated, but I think it's supposed to show their greatest expanse. Likely they're approaching that by now, but probably still aren't there. There are also allegedly barbarian kingdoms surrounding the Shang, which are in reality probably at least semi-civilized, especially the ones to the east and south. They are not, however, literate as far as anyone's discovered. Archaeology in China is considerably more difficult in the well-preserved than it is in the well-preserved deserts of the West, but no evidence has been found yet that I've heard of, anyway. In 1400, Zhu Xin has sat the throne for about 10 years, though the dating is not totally certain. He rules another 6 years before his death and is followed by his younger brother, Chang Jia. Chang Jia rules a relatively uneventful 25 years and is followed by his nephew, Zhu Ding. The exact nature of the Shang succession system is not really clear, at least to me. Heirs are probably designated, or else court officials have a major part in the process, because it is definitely not just father to son. Any disputes are probably just lost to us, because we really only have the equivalent of a king list for most of the Shang period, preserved on oracle bones, at least in terms of primary sources. Whoa, sorry. Zhu Ding rules for no less than 32 years before being followed by his cousin, Nangang. Nangang moves the capital to Yan, which is not an uncommon event in the Shang. They seem to move their capital once per century at least. And Nangang rules for 29 years before being followed by his cousin's son, Yang Jia, who takes the throne about 1307. Yang Jia conducts a campaign against the Dan Shan barbarians, who those are is not at all clear to me, and still sits the throne in 1300 BCE. Now, frankly, the near total isolation of the Shang from any other civilization, any innovations permeate to them only very slowly across the massive, indirect, and unreliable Central Asian trade routes. They're pretty much developing entirely independently from all the rest of the world's civilizations. Not 100%, but 95%. Far more so than any of the more interconnected civilizations, even the Indian one. And they don't have any peer rivals to fight either. Only the, not actually barbarians, despite what they continuously call them, but the weaker and less developed groups around their borders, which are definitely significantly behind as far as settled civilization goes. Over in the Americas, the Olmecs are still developing into what is becoming at last the first lasting civilization of the Western Hemisphere. They're based in the lowlands of what will later be Veracruz along the Gulf of Mexico, and they've developed the city that we now call San Lorenzo. It does not have walls, and it acts as the center of a large area used for maize-based agriculture, suggesting they are also a more or less isolated and at least semi-united civilization. They produce large structures and sculptures, such as these famous giant heads, and there's plenty of evidence for significant societal stratification within the city, houses of greatly varying size and sophistication and so on. All in all, the civilization is early and simple still, equivalent to Mesopotamia over 2,000 years ago at this point, but it's in existence, and it's beginning to grow. In musical developments, we've discovered a tablet bearing instructions for singing a hymn in Nikal accompanied by a harp. And these provide us the proof that a system of music notation has come into existence. It uses a musical scale made for a 9-stringed lyre, and although it's in a difficult to translate local dialect, it is possible to recreate and even play the music written in 1300 BCE, thanks to the working notation system. You're hearing that music now, of course, and you can look the full thing up easily. I'm not going to play all of it now, but it's on YouTube and elsewhere. Credit to Braden Olson for this version. This is the Hurrian Hymn to Nakal. In an extremely valuable bit of insight into the trade of this period, a ship has sunk off the coast of Turkey. This does not really help anyone in 1300, or change much of anything in 1300. But as it turns out, in a little over 3,000 years' time, it will be quite exceptionally valuable. This ship's about 50 feet long, 16 meters or so. It's built with planks and a sort of proto-keel, all of Lebanese cedar, which seems to be pretty much the ubiquitous material for ships in the Mediterranean of this time. It's pretty much the most suitable lumber in the area without having to import from forests in Central Europe or elsewhere. And this shipwreck contains... We're going to go over an inventory here because it's very revealing, honestly. The shipwreck contains hundreds of copper ingots, all with handholds, some shaped in such a way as to be loaded onto some kind of specialized saddle or harness for easy transport. The copper comes from Cyprus and is likely picked up recently since the ship sinks just off the coast of Turkey. It carries a ton of tin, a literal ton that is, presumably to be alloyed with the copper at smiths wherever the destination is. The tin originates from as far as Uzbekistan and the Taurus Mountains in Turkey, which further confirms well-developed trade routes stretch well into Central Asia by this time. She carries 150 jars of pine resin from Canaan, 175 intact cobalt blue, turquoise, and lavender glass ingots, ebony, ivory, hippo teeth, tortoise shells, snail opercula, ostrich egg shells, pottery, oil lamps, bronze drinking vessels, ivory cosmetics boxes in the shape of ducks, an early trumpet, amber from the Baltic, agate, carnelian, quartz, gold, faience, glass, several dozen pieces of gold jewelry, a gold chalice, a gold scarab, a bronze female figurine plated in sheet gold, arrowheads, spearheads, maces, daggers, swords, tools including sickles, awls, chisels, a saw, various others, 140 sets of pan-balance weights, including 19 carved into the shapes of animals, foodstuffs including nuts, figs, olives, grapes, cumin, coriander, pomegranates, wheat, barley. I recite this whole list to you in the hope that it really impresses on you all what the scale of what we're dealing with. By the late Bronze Age, which is this now, trade is not a matter of your town in the next. It's not even just a matter of your kingdom in the next. It's not a matter of wheat for metal or whatnot. Humanity by 1300 has a thriving commercial network which reaches pretty much across the known world, and the known world is further than you would think at this point. This single random trading ship, driven onto a headland in a storm by accident, carries goods from Scandinavia, Greece, Cyprus, Turkey, Uzbekistan, Palestine, Egypt, and more places besides, at least 9 or 10 different cultures. A dazzling array of goods, practical and, in many, many cases, decorative. If you think for a moment humanity has changed much in the last few thousand years, frankly, take a look at some of the contents of this ship. Makeup boxes and trumpets and cups and ivory and glass, and think again. This ship might be a little richer than average. It may have been carrying gifts from Mycenae to Egypt, as is common in the diplomacy and trade of the time. But even if it was, all these goods were obviously within the power of any random Mycenaean city-state to assemble. And it may have just been a common trading ship. Who knows how many were plying the waters at any one time. And the existence of this trade network is further confirmed by the existence, about this time, of pirates from Lycia who raid the copper port of Wallachia in Cyprus. These are the world's first known pirates, but they would definitely not exist without rich trade for them to pirate. No point being a pirate if there's nothing to steal. And so, we finally reached 1300 BCE. I am definitely going to have to start cutting this into less than century parts soon, because I am pretty sure this is well over an hour. But I am hoping to reach 1000 BCE first. We'll see how it goes. Egypt's new kingdom had a big religious crisis this century thanks to Akhenaten, but they've weathered the storm. The new kingdom remains the strongest power in the Fertile Crescent. The only problem? The resurgence of the Hittites to the north. They've crushed the Mitanni kingdom, built a new empire of their own, and are primed for a clash with Egypt over Syria. Babylon and Assyria have been able to increasingly assert themselves this century. Assyria is once again independent. Babylon has crushed their ancient rival Elam. But just as they've asserted their power and independence, they've developed a fierce rivalry with each other over the last few decades, and who knows where that will lead them. The Mitanni have been reduced from one of the dominant powers of the region to a remnant state in this century. India is in a bit of a shadowy semi-legendary period still, but is definitely beginning to develop a new state-level civilization. The Shang Dynasty continues to plug along in China. Not much is really changing, at least that's obvious to us from this distance in time and with the very limited available writing, but it's almost certainly slowly expanding, developing, and surviving. Civilization has finally arrived to stay in the Americas. The Olmecs are developing a city and a settled agricultural society. Music and trade are flourishing. But the world is not peaceful. Egypt and the Hittites are primed for an explosive confrontation over Syria. Babylon and Assyria have become sworn enemies. Who's going to come out on top between either of those four? Who knows? Is this state thing in India really going to take off? Is the Shang Dynasty just going to last forever? Subscribe and tune in next time to find out.